medievalism, which is what some people would like to believe over here, that Afghanistan has always been, some kind of backward country or something of that kind. In fact, if you look at social life in Kabul in the 1950s and early 1960s, it was a highly modern place, if I may put it this way. There was no sign of the Taliban back then, okay? So bear in mind that, when we speak of South Asia, what we're really speaking about, for the most part, are 5 countries here. And that's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Okay, right? A small island country to the south of India. The bulk of my lectures, the bulk of the readings will be focused on India, partly because the literature on India is vastly superior to the literature that we have. And when I say the literature, I'm referring here obviously to the scholarly, academic kind of literature on this part of the world. Okay, and of course India is the dominant cultural entity in that region, so that's another reason to focus on India. Pakistan did not exist, as you're going to find out in greater detail later on in this lecture, before 1947, nor did Bangladesh, right, for that matter. All right, so that's gives you a rough idea of what is the geographical expanse that we are talking about. Let me say something before I move to a substantive discussion of the contents of this course, and I'm going to go over the syllabus with you systematically. I want to sort of dispense with administrative matters in the beginning. So let me say something about the requirements in the books and things of that kind. Okay, the requirements for the class are fundamentally 3. The first is an informal requirement, and that is a requirement that you come to class. I don't take attendance, so and obviously in a class of this size, I'm not always going to know who's here and who's not here. But I hope that you get sufficiently interested and energized by the lectures that you hear, that you are inclined to come to lecture. Okay. Number 2, and that's the first of the formal requirements. You will submit to me a 5 to 7 page paper on a book called The White Tiger. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you may have started reading it. It's part of the syllabus, okay, and it's a book that was written last year by a young Indian writer, Arvind Adiga. And what I'm going to expect from you, if you look at the syllabus, I don't know if you brought a copy of it. I did send an email to the entire class asking you to print out your own copy of the syllabus. But in the syllabus, it sort of on page 3, it says that the paper should be on Arvind Adiga's book, The White Tiger. Do not write a book report. I do not want a book report. I do not want a summary of the book. What you will do is you will immediately move into an analysis of the book. For example, how does the writer deal with the topic of poverty in India? Right? Okay. What are the dominant tropes or ideas that the writer is working with? Is the distinction between urban and rural India central to the book? Is it peripheral to the book? Right? Right? So that's the sort of thing you'll do. You'll basically analyze the book, 5 to 7 pages, 5 to 6 pages, and the due date for this is given in the syllabus. This short paper will constitute roughly 1/3 of your grade, 35% of your grade. The last and final requirement, and that's obviously the principal requirement, the written portion of it, is a take-home final exam. Okay, so the take-home final exam, I think there are about 15 or 20 of you here who have taken a class with me previously, but it's pretty much that format that I've always followed for the upper division classes. And basically the format of the take-home final is you get 1 week to write the exam. It's an open book exam. You consult any number of books that you want. I mean, when we get closer to the date, I'm obviously going to give you some suggestions and tips. So I think that, for example, spending too much time on the internet is not very productive. If you've done the readings, that's all you need to have done in order to have actually answered the questions. If you've come to the lectures, you've done the readings, you don't need to go to any outside sources in order to answer any of the questions that you get on the exam. Right? And the format of the take-home final is you get 6 questions divided into 3 groups. So 2 questions in each group, and in group 1 you answer both the questions, and then in groups 2 and 3 you get 2 questions each, and you answer 1 out of the 2 questions in both the groups. So you answer a total of 4 out of 6 questions. You give me roughly 10 pages typed. Okay, that's the requirement of the take-home final exam. Okay, and as I said, if you've done the readings and you've come to the lectures, there is absolutely no reason why you should not be able to answer the questions that have been put on the final. Okay, so those are the requirements. Any questions about the requirements before I move to the readings and a discussion of what's available and so on? All right, 100 copies of a number of books have been ordered for you at the bookstore. Okay, and there are 4 books. One is a book by Amartya Sen, one is a book by myself, then there's a book by Adiga called The White Tiger, which I've already talked to you about, and then a book by Aditya Nigam and Nivedita Menon called Power and Contestation. Okay, so these are 4 books that have been ordered for you. Now, the number of students who are enrolled in this class is about 120, so the 100 copies that were ordered for you will not suffice. However, let me say a couple of things, okay? Number one, my book is not being received at the bookstore yet. We don't know when they'll get it. If they don't get it by the date that you're supposed to do the reading, we'll scrap the order from the bookstore and we'll have some portions of it put online. So you need not worry about that book at the moment, okay? It should get here within 10 days, but if it doesn't, then I will keep you informed about how you're going to do that particular reading. Okay, the White Tiger is a book that won the Booker Prize, which is the major literary award in the English-speaking world, and so therefore you can get it at virtually any bookstore. Okay, you can go to the your neighborhood Barnes and Noble, Borders, Amazon, and you should be able to actually get used copies for dirt cheap. Particularly on Amazon. Okay, so if you go to the bookstore, you find that they've run out of it. I would go to the general portion of the bookstore, by the way, because they're bound to have it, given that it won this major award. So I don't think you're going to have any problem in finding that book at all. Now that leaves Amartya Sen's book, which is also a book that is really widely available. And again, the bookstore, that is, I'm not talking about the textbook section, I'm talking about the general bookstore, should have copies of that, right? But if you don't find it, again, I would say just, find which books you don't have access to, and then just get collectively, a copy for yourself for each of the 2 or 3 books that you don't have, and get them from Amazon or whatever other vendor you want to use, and usually, by the way, that will work out cheaper because the bookstore here does not give discounts, and a lot of the other vendors do. Okay, so I don't want anybody to be able to say that, hey, we couldn't find copies of the books. Okay, I mean, 100 copies have already been ordered. I don't know how many if you've gone and picked up. I don't know if they've run out of it at this point in time. But I'm saying to you that with the exception of my book, which nobody here has access to at this point in time, so you're all equal there, okay, all the other books are easily available. Okay, now, in addition to that, you have a whole set of online readings. And when I last checked, all the links were working. I think there are only 1 or 2 readings in the second half of the course which have not been put online. But if you go to the syllabus and you put in your Bruin ID number, whatever you need in order to log in, you'll find that all the readings are accessible in PDF. All right, so you download the reading, whether you want to print it out for yourself or not, that's obviously a decision that you make. But all the readings are available online, other than the ones which come from the 4 books. Right? Okay, so you've got 4 books, and then you've got a whole set of online readings. The total reading is going to amount to about 125, some odd pages a week, okay, which is about right for a upper division class of this kind. The White Tiger, you're going to find, is very easy reading, so you should be able to read that over a couple of days if you put aside a few hours every day for that. And I would not wait until beginning of week 5 to start reading it. Okay, because the paper on that book is due in the middle of the term, and so if I were you, I would start digging into it within a week or 2, right? And some of the material that you might find useful in analyzing this book is material that is included in the syllabus in the first half of the class. All right, so that's why the syllabus has been constructed in such a way. This is I've taught this class before. I think maybe on 4 different occasions over the last 16 years that I've been here. But this syllabus is at least 50% new. The White Tiger was only published last year. The book by Nivedita Menon. So there are a lot of new readings, and partly because in the case of a country like India and sort of the political history, cultural history of India in the post-1947, Not only is there a whole new body of scholarly literature that keeps on coming out, but obviously, since we're dealing with the post-47 period down to the present day, virtually everything is of interest to us, and the country is in ferment. I mean, there's a great deal that is going on there. You might even find, for example, a film, I suspect that probably half of you, maybe all of you, or most of you have seen it, Slumdog Millionaire. You might even find that actually quite interesting to think about in light of the material that is going to be given to you in this particular course. Okay, so those are the course materials. Any questions about the course materials that anybody has? Yes?
Textbook store in Westwood has all the books beside your book for use price.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, right. So you should be able to, as I said, you should be able to access the books without any problem at all, right? There is a website. Yeah, a question over there. No, there's no midterm exam. No. Instead of a midterm exam, what you have is a paper. Yeah. There is a advanced graduate student who's actually finishing her PhD right now. Some of you again know her from the class that you took in the previous term. So she will be doing most of the grading. I'll be doing some of it, but she'll be doing the bulk of the grading. But as is the case with all of these kinds of classes, I will review every paper too. I mean, I'm not going to grade every paper, but I'll take a look and make sure that the grading has been done according to what I think is appropriate standards. Yeah. Okay. There is also, by the way, a website which is mentioned here, which is a website that I maintain. In fact, I started this website close to 12, 13 years ago. And this is a website on South Asia. It's ad-free. There are no pop-ups, nothing of that kind. It's solely on the history, politics, culture, architecture, religion, all of that of South Asia. I mean, there are about 400 articles on it, which have all been written by myself with the exception of 3 short pieces there. So you can, make use of that, because a good deal of that website actually deals with issues pertaining to contemporary India and the region around it. Okay, and as I said, there are pretty extensive sections on cinema, politics, culture, and so forth. I mean, there's obviously some material that deals with the history of India in the pre-1947 period, some going back to remote antiquity, right? But the bulk of it, I think you will find of interest, and you can use it as a reference guide as well for this course. Any further questions at all about requirements, materials, or administrative matters? Okay, and one last thing before I move to a more substantive discussion about the course. For those of you who are waitlisted, just come see me after class and you will automatically get enrolled, because I'll give you a PT number. Okay, all right. Let me begin with a couple of observations. Okay, and the first observation has to do with, as I said, with how we think about how the word was carved up. This has a long history. So, for example, when we look at the idea of the third world, well, when did this idea of the third world arise? Okay, what is the third world? And I think that in some general sense, all of you know what the third world is. It refers to the allegedly real or allegedly underdeveloped part of the world, the developing part of the world, right? Okay, and it's interesting, of course, that nobody really spoke about the second world. You would never hear that phrase. I mean, so from the first world you went to the third world. Well, what was the second world? And that had to do with the Soviet bloc, right, in the days of the Cold War. But the first thing to keep in mind here is that this way of thinking about the world is largely a post-World War II inheritance. Okay, it's largely a post-World War II inheritance, and it has to do with the fact that after the end of the war, just as Britain and France had been the dominant colonial powers, right, throughout the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century, after the conclusion of World War II, it is really the United States that became the dominant power, right? And one of the perks, if I may put it this way, or one of the privileges that comes with being a dominant power, is that you also try to shape the knowledge about the world according to your modes of thinking, right? So essentially the Americans basically carved up the world in certain ways. Now, they're not the only people to have done that. I mean, Spain and Portugal were a little bit more arrogant, if I may put it this way, because 500 years ago, one of the popes issued a papal bull, as it's called, and essentially told Spain and Portugal, well, I'm going to carve up the world, and you, Spain, and you, Portugal, take whatever you want. Okay, right? Right? And there was a papal bull that was issued, which basically carved up the world between Spain and Portugal. Of course, countries such as Britain and France, which were not, rising powers, were going to have nothing of that shortly thereafter, and that's when you get into the whole period of colonial wars and the scramble for power amongst the colonial powers. Okay, right now the United States, in my view, has an imperial history, as does Spain and Portugal and Britain and France. Okay, if we were doing a course on the US, then we would talk a lot more about that. But what I'm trying to suggest to you is that this idea of South Asia, okay, is fundamentally an American idea. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that the area didn't exist, of course, before that, but it was known by different names. Okay, and then, of course, we have to ask, well, how does naming something change it in some ways, too? Right? And I gave you the illustration of Afghanistan. I don't know how many of you know that when 9/11 took place, how many speakers of Pashto were serving in the CIA and the US military, you think? Make a guess. 50, 500, Pashto is one of the dominant languages in Afghanistan. One person in the entire academic and military intelligence of the United States who knew Pashto. And you want to fight a war in Afghanistan, okay? You're going to try to infiltrate, okay, that country, and you don't have a single person who knows the language there. And that's the situation you're really talking about, right? So, and why did Afghanistan then fall through the cracks? It partly has to do with the organization of knowledge. So South Asia means India, Pakistan, all of that. Then you get into the Middle East, and you're interested in the Middle East. Why? Because, well, for one thing, geopolitical strategies are important for colonial powers, for the US. Of course, oil-producing region of the world. What did Afghanistan have? Nothing. Partly some reasons fall through the cracks because they have nothing to offer to the dominant power. At least that's how they look at it. Okay? Now, their thinking might change, which is what happened when the Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan. And the present situation that you have owes a great deal to the history going back to the late 1970s when the Soviets moved into Afghanistan. And then, of course, you know that the United States, because the Soviet Union was obviously arch enemy number one, a communist power, so the United States decided to support an insurgency in Afghanistan. Right? And that insurgency, if I may put it this way, has never ended in some respects. Right? I mean, what you're seeing today is the legacy going back to the late 1970s and that period. Okay? I mean, the Taliban, how did they arise? They didn't arise from nowhere at all. Right? I mean, all of these factions, the Mujahideen. So the Mujahideen were supported by the Americans because they wanted these people to fight the Soviets. Right? And what I'm suggesting at the same time is that we had virtually no knowledge of this. In the US, there was virtually no real substantial knowledge of a country, and yet the United States was going to move into a full-fledged war, okay, in this part of the world. And the present administration has committed itself to an expansion of this war. And again, we're not going to really discuss the merits or demerits of that because that's not our ambition over here. But all of this is important as a preface because we're trying to understand, right, how we organize knowledge, why we have knowledge over some things and don't have it over other things, okay, and why it is that there is a particular relationship between knowledge and power, right? I mean, so the United States was a dominant power, and therefore it had some prerogatives, some privileges, and one of its privileges was its ability to shape, okay, the world of knowledge, right? So when you do social science, if you're living in India, I just spent a year and a half there recently, came back in early January of this year, and if you're living in India, you're going to Indian universities, economics and sociology are taught exactly the same way that they're taught here. That is, the substance, the content of is exactly the same. So it's the same textbook by Paul Samuelson that you would use in Economics 101. Now Paul Samuelson's probably been updated here, but for 40 years that was the dominant economics textbooks used in United States, US universities. And the same textbook was used in 80 countries around the world, whether they were democracies or dictatorships or authoritarian countries. Somehow the economics that you did was the same, even though the dominant economic regime of that country might have been different, you know, right? So we are saying that there is a certain template, right, of what constitutes a body of knowledge in social science, and then that template gets applied almost mechanically, right, no matter where you are. Right? So this is one thing I think that I would like you to be aware of, because one of the things that we're going to try to do in this class is we're going to try to have a critical outlook, okay, and see what are the presuppositions of the author. How does the author shape his or her conception of what constitutes knowledge about India? Okay? And so, for example, what is politics? And I think that one of the unfortunate things is that, for example, in the US, I think the last election was a little bit different because you had a lot more grassroots organizing in this election, at least, especially on the part of the left, or I shouldn't say the left because there is no left in America, but I should say on the part of the Democrats. Okay, you had some kind of grassroots organizing, okay, which you've really had on the part of the Republicans for a long period of time. Okay, but by and large, politics in America has meant Republicans or Democrats. That's what politics means. You know, so you vote for one or the other. And if you try to vote for somebody else, such as Ralph Nader in a previous election, then you are the spoiler, which is the title that was given to him. Okay, the spoiler. Okay, now does politics mean the same thing? So when we get to India, does politics mean, oh, either you're a member of a party called the Indian National Congress, now simply called the Congress for the last so many decades, or you're a member of the party or a supporter of a party called the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a Hindu right-wing party, right? Or does politics mean something different? It may mean it may mean political parties, but you'll see that one of the fundamental transformations that has taken place in India is the advent of politics from the ground. That is that, you know, 200 million people who've lived in absolutely submerged lives of oppression for the most part, rising somehow. Now that doesn't mean that all of them have risen into the middle class by any stretch of the imagination, right? But nonetheless, we are saying that there is an enormous kind of ferment that's taking place on the ground. So various kinds of alliances, various kinds of grassroots movements, right? Ecological movements. And I think one of the things about politics in India is that politics there obviously works with other categories, some of which are not even you're familiar with in the US, such as a category of caste. We'll talk about caste obviously later on in this class, which is quite critical. And you see a very unusual alliances forming in India in the last 15, 20 years. Alliances between Muslims and lower castes are to be expected in some ways, because you could say that they both belong to, you know, relatively oppressed groups, relatively, okay, right? But how about alliances between, for example, lower castes and Brahmins, the upper castes, and Muslims, okay, and yet another group? Now, how would one explain those kinds of alliances, right? So this is what I mean, that I think that politics there has a slightly wider expanse, okay, than it does, it seems to me, in the United States. Okay? So what are the kinds of questions we're going to be concerned with in this particular class? Right? To some extent, obviously, we are going to follow a chronological trajectory, but only to some extent, because this class is not really designed to give you a sense of, okay, so 1947, you know, this happened. We'll begin in 1947, in fact, in the mid-1940s, just shortly before independence. And we're not going to go through the history of democratic elections, because India has had democratic elections, right, all the way from the 1947 down to the present day. In fact, one of the reasons why India is always a country of some interest, other than the fact that it's a huge country population-wise and has obviously an extraordinarily complex civilization, but one of the reasons why it's of interest to policymakers is that, you know, they look at the so-called third world. Okay, and they look at the fact that in the so-called third world, and the third world here would be essentially countries that were under colonial domination. I think that would be one simple way that you could look at the third world. Okay, but if you look at this part of the world, countries that were under colonial domination, very few of these countries were able to maintain after they achieved independence, maintain democratic institutions. Okay? Have what you would call a democracy. And whether the US and the UK are the best models of democracy, again, that's something that is quite debatable in my view, right? But whatever one's view of how good or imperfect American or British or French or Australian democracy is, there's no question whatsoever that you can distinguish a democracy from a totalitarian state or a military dictatorship. There is a marked difference between the two. Okay? And so India was one of the few countries in the world, from that part of the world, that is the world that was colonized, which after independence has been able to persist with its democratic institutions, have elections, have a free press, and so on. All right? And that's one reason why I think India has always been of interest, at least to some degree, to some measure. Okay? Now, where we ought to begin with, before we move into the history of 1947 and the period thereafter, is the mid-1940s. And for those of you already are familiar with this, you'll have to forgive this very short capsule history, but I think it's essential for those of you who don't have a background in Indian history and are coming into this, without any previous knowledge of it. You have to recall that India was under British rule for a period of over 200 years. Right? And I think that one of the things that distinguishes the history of India in the 20th century is that India was doubtless a country that had a different trajectory, largely because its nationalist leadership was led by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, right? Or Mahatma Gandhi as he's better known. Right? And of course, as you know, one of Gandhi's principal contributions is his whole practice and theory of mass nonviolent resistance. Right? Because if you really look at it, during the period that the nationalist movement was at its height, which is in the 1920s, 1930s, until the achievement of independence in 1947, August 1947, India really had an anti-colonial movement which was marked by the absence of violence. Right? And I think that was fundamentally transformative for India in some ways. A very good contrast for those of you who are interested in pursuing this question later on is with Algeria, where in Algeria you had a resistance movement, and you had a resistance movement that did not disavow the use of violence at all. In fact, there was a kind of a fetish about violence, if I may put it this way, because one of the principal architects, that is, if you look at it from the standpoint of theoretical critical writings, Frantz Fanon, who wrote about Algeria, there was a kind of a fetishism about violence, I think, in some of his writings, right? And the interesting thing is that after the achievement of independence in Algeria, in the decades thereafter, Algeria went through terrible periods of what you might describe as civil war. Okay? And I think India was largely spared that, with, of course, this huge exception. We're going to talk about this exception, and that is the violence that accompanied the independence of India and the partition of India in 1947 itself. Right? But I'm saying to you that if you compare the anti-colonial or nationalist movement in India with the anti-colonial nationalist movement in Algeria or in Indonesia or Malaysia, right? I think one of the reasons why India has had, it seems to me, these democratic institutions, a kind of an intelligentsia that has, to some extent at least, tried to check the excesses of the state, I think in part it's because of the legacy of Gandhi. Okay? And I think that makes Indian history markedly different. Now, before I discuss that, let me make one related point. It's a point that is seldom mentioned in world histories about this period. So if you read, let's say, somebody like Niall Ferguson. Okay, so Niall Ferguson is now a professor at Harvard, used to be at Oxford, and he's become one of the most well-known historians of the 20th century in the world. The astonishing thing is that if you read some of his works, you would never know that in the second half of the 20th century, the principal political movement was decolonization. Decolonization. That is that you had countries such as India, Indonesia, okay, countries in Africa, of course, Ghana, Nigeria, right? And in all of these countries, dozens of them, the principal, okay, political ambition which was realized was the attainment of independence, freeing yourself from the domination of colonial rule, right? So decolonization. And this decolonization never really appears, as I've said, in the kinds of histories written by people like Niall Ferguson, because their vision is entirely dominated by what the West is doing, right? The West is not doing anything when you get to decolonization. These are countries with nationalist movements who are trying to throw out the colonizing power. But their vision of the world is shaped by, well, this is what the US was doing, or this is what France or Britain was doing, and of course by the Cold War. Because there's no question about it that from the American standpoint, the dominant political question of the day had to do with, well, do you ally yourself with the Soviet bloc, or do you ally yourself with the US and with NATO, right? Okay? So decolonization is the wider context that you're going to have to keep in mind. I've given you two wider contexts. One is decolonization. The other is the extremely pertinent question of the relationship of knowledge to power. Okay? All right. So if you look at the history of India now, right, before 1947, because 47 is obviously, and thereafter, down to the present day, is the thrust of this class, but I think that context, you will understand it better when you understand that India was, as I said, a country that was ruled by Britain for over 200 years. Now, in the 1920s, the Indian National Congress, so that's the name of the major nationalist organization. It's called the Indian National Congress. I'm going to refer to it as a Congress for short. Okay? And in fact, in the last 4 decades, it's only been known really as the Congress for the most part. Okay? So in the 1920s, the Indian National Congress, which was founded in 1885, transforms itself under the leadership of Gandhi into a mass organization. Right? Interesting history in itself, but just take that as a fact, if I may put it to you this way. Okay? And what the Congress will do under Gandhi is offer, obviously, resistance to colonial rule. And by the 1930s, the demand for independence will become a full-fledged demand. Okay? The demand for independence from British rule in India. Now, let's put into place another set of factors. Then we're going to have to put it all together. Let's look at the composition of India. Right? If you look at India today, right? So you're talking about a population where the majority, and here I'm speaking simply of a numerical majority. Okay? The numerical majority is the Hindus, who constitute roughly 78, 79% of the population. Right? Then you have the Muslims, who constitute somewhere around, let's say, 13% of the population. Okay? And the remaining, some 8%, is constituted by various others, and that would include the Sikhs, okay, Christians, okay, so these would be two dominant. Buddhists, very small in number now, right? Very small in number. Their numbers are growing, and their numbers are growing because of conversion from the lower ranks of Hindus. So some are converting to Christianity, some to Buddhism, particularly in places such as northeast India, but you also have conversions going on in the middle of India. Right? So that's roughly the distribution of the population that we're talking about. And we're looking at it here only in terms of religion at this point. Okay? We're not looking at it in terms of, let's say, class or caste. And if you had to look at it with respect to the question of class, which is not really germane to the point I want to make, but I want to mention it now, just so that this fact sort of registers in your mind. In India, the middle class is estimated at about 300 million. Okay, but before we talk a little bit about that estimate, let me pose a question to you and see if somebody would try to give an answer to that. What do you understand by the middle class? I mean, you hear this all the time, right? You hear about something called the middle class. So what is the middle class? And you can't be taught, you cannot be tautological in your answer by saying the middle class is not the upper class or the lower class. Because then we're going to have to say, well, what is the upper class and what is the lower class? So what is the middle class? Yes?
You're comfortable, you're not struggling to survive, but you also don't have enough money for too many luxuries.
Okay, so you're not struggling to survive and you're comfortable. So what does, let's push it a bit. What does comfortable mean?
Comfortable means that you don't have to have welfare, you don't have to know welfare, you have to have food stamps, you have to struggle daily to get food on the table. You can probably afford a couple of things that aren't completely necessary to survival,
Okay.
but not to really far.
Okay. So would you say that the middle class is a relatively modern concept, or do you think it has a history going back to antiquity? Relatively modern. Okay. And why would you say that? I would agree, but I would like to know why.
This is just from what I learned last quarter in my comparative politics class.
Mhm.
Because the peasantry was kind of eliminated in Britain society, at least, that gave way for those peasants to go to steel mills and things like that in bigger cities and get jobs and work and kind of create a middle class. Is that right, kind of?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're roughly in the region that I think we want to be in here, but we're trying to get a little bit of a grip. The reason why I'm probing this is that I have seen estimates of the Indian middle class which run all the way from 125 million to 350 million. Now, if the gap, let's say if the estimates were 125 to 135, I'd say that, well, we don't really have a problem on our hands. That is that there seems to be some kind of consensus. But 125 to 350 million, I mean, that's a huge range, right? Which clearly means that the people who are furnishing the estimates are working with vastly different conceptions of what they consider to be the middle class. And the answer that we had at the back, which again is in the region that we want to be in, but I think we'd have to try to maybe be more analytical, try to sharpen it a little bit further, is that, all right, so you don't have to, middle class, somebody who's in the middle class doesn't have to struggle for his or her living, okay, and is comfortable. Comfortable is a slightly difficult category, I think, because, I may be comfortable with 10 pairs of shirts, and another person might think, well, that's pathetic. I mean, you need at least 50, okay? I mean, I bet you if you open up most people's wardrobes, you're not going to find less than 50, I mean, if you're so-called middle class, okay? Right? So you see what I mean? That comfortable is far too subjective a category here. And we'd have to say, well, when did the middle class really historically begin? And so I think you've given a bit of an answer over there. That is that the emergence of the middle class has to do with, I mean, you didn't use a phrase, but you could say, by the way, the Industrial Revolution, right? I mean, you said it had to do with the elimination, in a way, with the kinds of oppressions that the peasantry had to go through, more or less, okay? Right? So that the predominant category, let's say in Western Europe, was the peasant, and then you had the aristocrats. But you didn't really have much of a kind of a middle class. So the middle class really comes around when you have something called the Industrial Revolution, which is going to raise the standard of living for not just a few people, but for a substantially large number of people. And there are other elements that we'd have to put into the picture, such as increasing mechanization of labor. Increasing mechanization of labor, labor-saving devices that you use in your home, the washing machine, vacuum cleaner, whatever it is, right? I mean, all of the people who use this are likely to fall into the middle class. Okay, certainly. Right? You could say all of that. But anything else we could say about the middle class that comes to mind? Yes.
I mean, I would say that it depends on that if they're self-sustaining.
Yeah.
And it also is a largely political term because it depends on the state or whatever the political party is wants to define it as. Because
Yes.
it's supposed to take care of that class because that class is supposed to be the majority that kind of puts them into power. So it depends on what the definition that they want to give to that class. Like what is comfortable, what is self-sustaining, how much?
Yeah.
Because the lower class, they would have to provide services or not.
Right. Right.
So it
Right.
depends on the definition that they give to self-sustaining.
Okay.
I would say that middle class is usually able to save. They don't have to use all that they earn on like just everyday living.
Yeah, but is able to save is different than saving, because one of the problems in the US, by the way, virtually nobody in this country saves anything. I mean, you just go and spend it. Not only do you spend it, you actually live on credit cards. I mean, this is not Japan or India where the savings rates are very high. For most of the people, I mean, the minute you make any amount of money in India, you're a driver, you go to your employer and say, yeah, you know, look, I don't know enough about investment. Do you think you could, you know, I'm going to give you this chunk of money. Can you just put it in some account for me? Because I don't know how to manage my money. I'm completely illiterate, right? I mean, the driver will say that. I mean, here, you know, the thing is that the relationship between savings and the middle class, I think, completely disappeared. So I think, in principle, what you're saying may be right, but it has no relationship at all to what the middle class became in this country. Now, I want to suggest a couple of things. We could go on with this forever, but I want to suggest a couple of things, right? Because recall the discussion that we were having, and I said you have to keep in mind, right? The discussion we were having was, okay, so you've got a nationalist movement in India, you've got resistance to colonial rule, okay? That's one set of factors, okay? And then we said, okay, let's look at the composition of the population, right? And we looked at it in religious categories, right? So many Hindus, so many Muslims, etc., etc. I'm saying, all right, so what is the, so, but obviously, when we look at the composition of the population, religion is only one category. I mean, there are numerous other categories that you can use. All right. So, by the way, as you're going to find out, using gender is going to be extremely critical, because India is one of the few countries in the world which has a skewed balance of males and females. One of the few. It's not the only one. There's several others. Okay. But all of the countries in South Asia. Okay. Right. So, what makes the countries in South Asia have something in common other than Sri Lanka? Right? All of them have an extraordinarily large number of men in relation to women, which is exactly the opposite of virtually all parts of the world, except, again, a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And in India, the ratios are completely skewed, right? So the ratio at the present moment is, for every 1,000 males in India, you have 931 females, right? I mean, that's a serious problem. A very, very serious problem. So this is what I mean. The composition, that before we even get into, all right, let's do a feminist analysis of this or that, let's at least know what the composition of the population is in all of these categories. So when we were talking about class, one of the problems with the middle class is a notoriously elastic concept. You know, you can, I mean, it was kind of suggested here, you can make it what you want it to be, almost. Now, I think, yes, it has a definite relationship to such things as, you know, standards of living, comfort, right? But I think that there's a way to pin it down, because I'm going to suggest to you that in India, there is a particular tacit definition of middle class. Nobody will tell you that this is what the middle class is, but this is what they're working with. And I think it's unacceptable, the idea of middle class that they're working with. And I think that that's something they've learned from the US, although that's not what the concept of the middle class in the US was a long time ago. Okay? Because when the middle class developed in the United States, it meant in part some idea of a commons. Okay, so now I want to use a different language. That is that you belong to the middle class because the state said, we are going to have some conception of the commons. There are some common social goods that everybody is entitled to, and you don't have to pay for them. You do not have to pay for such common social goods as public schooling, right? Right? That there should be access to free public schooling for everybody. Okay? A public library. These are common social goods. When a middle class develops, these are people who are going to begin to use these services. There's a relationship between these services and the emergence of a middle class as well. Okay? Now, I think that disappeared in the US. I mean, one of the problems in the US is there's no conception of common social goods here at all today, virtually. You have to pay for everything. Everything. I mean, it's like you want to use wireless at the airport, well, you better have a credit card. Unlike in Europe, where at the airports, if you ever go to an airport in Vienna or Budapest, for example, you know, you just take your laptop and just start the wireless. You don't pay for it. It's free. Here, you have to pay for everything. Then you're entitled to it. Okay? So this conception of common social goods started disappearing. Now in India, the problem is highly aggravated because I think in India, and this is my definition of the middle class is nothing except a class that consumes. That's all. Strictly related to consumption. If you have certain levels of consumption, you're the middle class. If you don't, you're not. And in fact, in America, who is a poor person? A poor person is someone who just doesn't consume enough, frankly. I think that this is the tacit working definition of who is a poor person in the United States. Just as a tacit working definition of who is a middle class person in India has to do with your levels of consumption, right? So if you consume up to a certain level, you're middle class. If you don't, you're not. Okay? Now, if you go back now to the question that we were looking at, the question that we were looking at was, all right, so you've got this movement here in India, you've got anti-colonial movement, and this anti-colonial movement is going to run into a problem. The problem it's going to run into is that by the late 1930s, you can date it a little bit earlier, but let's just say for the sake of convenience, late 1930s, there is going to be a demand for the creation of a separate state. Okay? Because at that time, the distribution of the religious groups was different than what it is now. Remember I said to you about now you're saying about 13% Muslim. Well, in undivided India, so when I say undivided India here now, right, so here's a, this is India over here today, okay, and here is Pakistan, right, and of course then to the west here is Afghanistan, okay, and here is a country called Bangladesh, right, and this by the way is a little teardropped island, Sri Lanka, okay, and Nepal is over here, okay, Bhutan is over here, don't even worry about Bhutan, all right, although they have generated one fantastic idea. That's one idea they've generated. So they don't have the conception of gross national product. They have a conception, they called it gross national happiness. I think it's a little gross, frankly, because you can't do much with it. But instead of saying we're going to measure how good a country is by looking at the gross national product, which I also think is a rather absurd idea, frankly, but it would put 99.9% of economists out of business if they accepted what I'm saying. Right? So the kingdom of Bhutan, Bhutan is a kingdom. Okay, so it has a constitutional monarchy. It's a constitutional monarchy, which some people think is very exotic, but frankly, Great Britain is a constitutional monarchy too. I mean, I don't know why people don't think Britain is exotic, because it certainly is. Right? Having a constitutional monarchy in 2009, right? And spending millions and millions on the Queen and some of her derelict children, right? Some, in fact, I should say all of her children are derelict, but nonetheless, now you've got Bhutan over there, you've got Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. So in undivided India would include all of this, because there was no such, not Afghanistan here, there was no such country as Pakistan and Bangladesh at that point in time. And when Britain was ruling India, okay, even at the height of its power, only 2/3 of the country was directly under British rule. This is something you have to really know, because it's going to be very important to understand some of the conflicts, such as the conflict that's still taking place in Kashmir. Okay? Only 2/3 of the country. So you had little places such as this city over here. This is called Hyderabad. Okay? Right? And then you have this state here, and this is a rough map, obviously, Kashmir. Okay? Now, why am I mentioning this to you? Because when I say that Britain ruled 2/3 of the country, there were about 550 native states, they were called, native states. So these were states, Kashmir and Hyderabad are examples. I'm giving you names of 2 of them. All right? And you just follow the train of thought, you'll see exactly where we're going with this. Right? So you have 550 native states, and 550 native states, 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 550 what this meant was that the ruler of Kashmir, the ruler of Hyderabad, and the ruler of all of those other states was nominally an independent ruler. I say nominally because Kashmir could not have foreign relations with the United States or with France or with Holland. You didn't have that much autonomy. But what it meant was the British said, okay, we're not going to rule directly over you, because if they rule directly, that means that they need to have some measure of their own administration. They need to have some of their own troops. Okay, it's an investment, right? What we're going to do is we're going to give you some degree of protection. If somebody comes and attacks you, we will protect you. In return, you're going to pay us a sum of money annually. Okay? And you are going to be in charge of your own administration. In matters such as education, hygiene, public sanitation, right, education, right? But you are not allowed to have foreign relations, which means you cannot be a sovereign state. So Kashmir was not a sovereign state. Hyderabad was not a sovereign state. Okay? That's what you have to bear in mind. This is the geopolitical situation of India, okay? And when I say that India was ruled by Britain, what I'm really referring to here is I'm not referring to the native states, and I'm referring to the rest of it, which includes Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now, at that point in time, in the late 1930s, early 1940s, the Muslim population of India would have been roughly one-fourth. Okay? So about 25%. Right? And in the late 1930s, a demand is going to emerge. The demand has a very long history. I cannot go over that history, obviously, because that really belongs to a different course. But the demand is for the creation of a separate state, which will be a Muslim majority state. Okay, a Muslim majority state, which means, in other words, that the people who made that demand, led by a man called Muhammad Ali Jinnah, known as the founder of Pakistan. By the way, let me also add as a little footnote that simply because he's demanding a Muslim majority state and he's a founder of a Muslim state, that doesn't mean that he was a practicing Muslim. Most people automatically assume that he was. No, not at all. He was entirely secular. He loved his wine and his pork. Okay? Let's be very clear about that. This man is not in any sense a practicing Muslim. He's completely secular. And in fact, I want to insist on that because I want to suggest to you that this is true of many of the people who appear to be the most fanatic or zealous defenders of a certain faith. Right? I think that they are the ones who are actually least committed to their faith, because I think for them, their religion is simply a political tool. All right? And this was certainly true of Jinnah. He was not somebody who was, and in fact, I think he was very secular, right? But he wants a separate state from Muslims. Why? Because he's going to argue that in a India dominated by the Hindus, okay, that is over 70% of the population of India would have been Hindu, right? If there had been no Pakistan, in a country dominated by the Hindus, his argument was the Muslims are going to be oppressed. They will be a minority. Whether he was right in thinking that or not is a question that we can't take up over here, right? Because then we'd have to look at the whole history of Hindu-Muslim relationships in India. We're going to have to see whether he had any justification for thinking that at all. But that is how he thought, and this demand is going to become more and more vociferous, right? It's going to become a movement. And by the mid-1940s, after the end of World War II, it was pretty much clear that this demand would have to be conceded. Now, there are problems, okay, in conceding this demand. The most eminent of these problems, and it will become transparent to you the minute I mention it. The minute I mention it, you'll see, well, of course, that had to be a problem, was, all right, so you want to create a Muslim majority state, but if the Muslims are spread throughout the country as they are, how do you do that? How do you do that? For example, Hyderabad here had a huge percentage of Muslims. A very famous place here called Lucknow, with a large Muslim population. And when I say large here, I'm not talking about 5 or 10%. I'm talking about Muslim majority. Majority of the people are Muslims. Okay? But the majority of the Muslims are living in this part of the country and in this part of the country. That's another problem, because in between you've got over 1,000 miles of territory. So how are you going to create a Muslim majority state? Unless you're going to create multiple Muslim majority states, which was not on the cards. Nobody wanted that. Right? How are you going to create a Muslim majority state? You can create one, but if you want all the Muslims to live there, then there's going to have to be massive migrations into this, and then all the people who are non-Muslims may have to move out. Right? But what if you didn't want to move? Right? What if you were living in Hyderabad, you're a Muslim and you don't want to move? Why should you move? There's no reason why you should move. I mean, somebody wants a Muslim majority state, let them have it. Right? Why should I want to move? If I'm a Muslim in Hyderabad, and I'm doing fine. All right? So this is something you have to think about. Right? You've got this problem over here, a Muslim majority, demand for a Muslim majority state. And in fact, Jinnah had this idea where he was going to, so all right, how are we going to protect the people here? Let's supposing that we make this into a Muslim majority state, okay, and this will become part of that. So this is going to be, you know, as I've put it ironically many times, and it's absolutely true, that one of the misfortunes of being a child in Pakistan was that the only way you could draw a map of Pakistan was you first had to draw a map of India, your arch enemy, right? Because, hey, you've got one part of the country here and one part of the country over here. And Jinnah had this idea that they were going to build a corridor, a little corridor, which would be over 1,000 miles long for the protection of Muslims. Right? Of course, that idea didn't fly. I mean, that was a daft idea, if there ever is a daft idea. Right? Right? But this was part of the plan. Anyhow, the plan is executed without the corridor, and a separate state called Pakistan is going to come around. This is not going to be known as Bangladesh at that point. It's going to be known as East Pakistan. Okay? And we're going to have to get to the history of why East Pakistan broke away from Pakistan, okay, and became known as Bangladesh in 1971. We're going to have to get to that much later on. We will get to it. Right? But for the time being, what you need to remember is you've got Pakistan here. This is colloquially known as West Pakistan, and this is part of Pakistan, and it's known as East Pakistan. This is called the partition of India. The partition. The partition, by the way, again, I'm going to drop these ideas. I don't have time to pursue all of them. It's up to you to do that if you're interested. But this was a favorite strategy of the British, wherever they went. A favorite strategy. Think about Palestine. I mean, the problems of Palestine today, in part, have to do with the creation of the mandate and the partition. Cyprus, Ireland, Northern Ireland, right? Okay? And the Republic of Ireland. Well, how did Northern Ireland become separate? What's the British? The English. Favorite strategy, partition. Okay? So, what you have here is the partition, Batwara. Batwara is a word in, you know, parceling out the goods. Right? Now, before I get into the story of the partition a little bit, let me tell you how they decided to do it, which is an astonishing story in itself. I'm going to take only a minute over it, and I'm going to suggest that you go to the internet, or if you still like to look up books in the library, you check out a book by W.H. Auden, one of the great 20th century poets, and he wrote a little poem on the partition. Okay? Because the question for the British was, all right, so we're going to concede this demand in consultation with Indian leaders, right? In consultation with the leaders of the Muslim League. So the nationalist organization that Jinnah represented was the Muslim League. Okay? And then the major nationalist organization in India, I've already mentioned that, is a Congress. Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, whose name is going to come up obviously a great many times, who's going to become the first Prime Minister of India. All of these people are associated with the Congress. Okay? Now, so the question for the British was, okay, we're going to concede this demand. When you concede a demand, so you say, okay, we're going to draw a line somewhere, right? You draw a line, let's say you just draw the line over here. Okay? I mean, if, for example, you had a river flowing, you know, just by sheer coincidence, right like there, and somehow all the Hindus fell here and all the Muslims fell here, it would be very nice, but that happens in fairy tales. It doesn't happen in real life, because when you draw a line somewhere, you're going to find that, hey, there are lots of Hindus who are now in Pakistan. They don't want to be in a Muslim majority state, do they? And then there are Muslims who've been left behind on this part. And they don't want to be in India, some of them, either. Right? And how do you draw a line? What the British did was, they got from Britain a man whose chief qualification for the understanding of Indian history and geography was that he had never been to India. That was his chief qualification, Sir Cyril Ratcliffe. Okay, and then he gets knighted for his efforts. He absolutely, positively loathed India, if you read his diaries. In fact, when he talks about the time, because he had to come from Britain, and he became what was called the chairman of the Boundary Commission. So they appoint a boundary, because they have to draw a boundary. Right? And the Boundary Commission, there's some Indians who are Hindus and some Indians who are Muslims and a few Indians who are Sikhs. Just table that for the aside again. We'll get to them later on at some point. Okay? And the decision is then made, and but he's a chair of the commission, so he's got overriding powers. Right? And if you read his diaries, he complains half of the time about the absolutely rotten time he had in India because, you know, there was mosquitoes, he was plagued by diarrhea, you know, all of that. And here he is, he's been charged with the fate of millions. Millions. Right? That's his main concern at this point. So he is going to draw a boundary. When he draws a boundary, there are people who are exceedingly unhappy. And one of the short stories that you're reading for this week is by Manto, one of the greatest short story writers in the world. It's a short story about lunatics. So there's a lunatic asylum. Who gets the lunatics? Does Pakistan get the lunatics? Because you're going to parcel out everything, right, equally. Or does India get the lunatics? Right? Okay? I mean, seriously. You know, because they had to parcel out everything. So 100 pencils, so we give, you know, 80 to India, 20 to Pakistan. Right? Because that's Pakistan's percentage of the population now, 20. Right? Whatever the number is. That's how they are going to think about it. But the major problem there had to do with, yeah, you've got a population here and over here on the eastern side. Don't forget the eastern side here, okay? And the people who are now suddenly finding that they were in India, they were born in India, their forefathers have been in India for, you know, centuries, and now suddenly they're in another nation state called Pakistan. And they have no inclination to be there at all, right? And then there are Muslims who, because the line was drawn in such a way that they got left behind, and they want to be in Pakistan. So you're going to have the largest mass migration in human history at one short period of time. 11 to 15 million people are going to move borders. And that meant, you know, so you've got Hindus who are going to move from here, right? Hindus moving in here, and Muslims moving from here to here.
I'm sorry, what did you say the number was?
11 to 15 million people, okay? Right? And it's in a short period of time. And people were bitter because you had to leave in a rush. You had to leave in a rush. Suddenly, lines been drawn, people who are going to exploit the situation, right? So you're a Muslim family, you know, you own property across the border, you want to go over into Pakistan. Well, what do you do with your property? You leave it, and you hope that there will be restitution, as it's called. That is that, you know, that at some point when things have settled down, you can file a claim. And claims were filed, but only 10% of the claims, for example, were ever adjudicated. And then you got, of course, a lot less than your market price, you know, right? But those are, in the scale of the things, in the scale of atrocities, you know, there's maybe minor things. I'm not going to say they are always minor, because attachment to land can mean a lot to people, right? I mean, you ask Native Americans, and one of the problems is people have to understand their attachment to the land, okay? So what you have here is you have a situation where you're going to have a mass migration and you're going to have mass killings. But these killings have to be distinguished from the killings of the Holocaust, for example, okay, which had taken place only a few years ago in Europe, right? They have to be distinguished very, very carefully. And when I say killings here, I'm talking about relatively large numbers, huge numbers. We don't know exactly how many people were killed. We're something in the vicinity of 1 million people were killed in the space of 6 to 8 months. But these are not orchestrated killings by the state. There is no Nazi state here which is methodically registering the number of each person, the number of each Jewish inmate assigned to Dachau or Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, one of the concentration camps, giving them a number, then put in a register. No, these are spontaneous. People who just, in a sense, are caught up in the events, right? Extremely upset by what's happened, in some cases losing members of their family, right? And of course, it's a cycle. So it takes place over a very short period of time, 6 to 8 months, right? And then it stops. Okay, right? That's part of the story there that I think that you have to keep in mind. And I want to now add 2 elements before we disperse for the day. Element number 1, let's go back to the native states. When Pakistan is created on 14th August and India becomes independent on 15th August 1947, the native states were given an option. Each native state had 3 options, okay? In effect 2. Option 1, sign a treaty with India and agree to become absorbed into India. You become a part of India. You are no longer an independent state. But they were never sovereign states, remember that, because a sovereign state is a state that has the power to exercise foreign relations independently, among other things. There are other criteria you could add. Right? But they were independent in that sense in which I described to you already. Sign a treaty, you become part of India. Or option 2, sign a treaty, become part of Pakistan. Option 3, become independent, or try to become independent, rather I should say, because nobody was prepared to let them become independent. What if the ruler of Hyderabad said, oh, I'm going to be independent? Okay, and this is a small landlocked state within India. Okay, I don't think either India or Pakistan were going to permit that. Okay, right? I mean, that would be like putting in, a small landlocked state within Texas. It might be a good idea, frankly, but I mean, the United States would never permit that at all. That is, out of the question, right? So, the ruler of Kashmir is a Hindu, yes.
These states are the ones that were never ruled by Britain?
Yeah, the native states, the 550 native states, the vast majority of them, I mean, with a couple of exceptions, all signed treaties with India. Okay? The Kashmir is going to be a problem case. The problem persists down to the present day. The ruler is a Hindu. The Maharaja is a Hindu. The majority of the population is Muslim. And when a native ruler decides that he or she is going to, it's all he's in this case, there had been women who had been rulers of native states as well, but when a ruler decides, I think this is, okay, when a ruler decides that he wants to sign a treaty, he's supposed to do it in consultation with his subjects, that is, with the population. Now, the ruler of Kashmir was ambivalent, couldn't decide what to do. And here I'm giving you the standard narrative that comes from India. There are other competing narratives that have come in, but this is, I would say, the narrative that is most widely heard. That before he could make a decision, a few months after independence, raiders from Pakistan, dressed as tribesmen, come into Kashmir and try to take over Kashmir. And when I say Kashmir here, in particular, that means the Srinagar, the valley of Kashmir, okay, which really is, as Babar said, paradise on earth. I mean, it is absolutely the most gorgeous place you can think of, okay? And so these raiders come in, and the ruler of Kashmir has to make a decision, because if he does, they're virtually at his doorstep, they're going to come into the center of the city, they're going to take it over, right? So he has to make a decision. What he does is he calls up the Indian Prime Minister. India has now been free for a couple of months. Of course, the Prime Minister is Jawaharlal Nehru, okay, and says, I want your assistance. I want you to send troops. And Nehru says, I will only send troops to you on the condition that you sign a treaty of accession. Treaty of accession meaning treaty where you relinquish your powers and Kashmir becomes part of India. And he did. He did sign the treaty, right? And so India is going to send troops. There's going to be a battle. It's going to eventually become a mini war between India and Pakistan. So right after independence, India and Pakistan are going to get launched into the first war. Okay. Well, we're going to have to stop over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up this part of the story. It'll just take another minute, and I'm going to add that second element, which is the role of Gandhi in the last couple of years and the assassination of Gandhi, and we're going to take up the story from there on Thursday. Please be sure, and this is a norm for all the lectures, you should try to do the readings for that entire week, okay, before you come to class.